The turbulent 1960s. Kennedy was inaugurated on January 20th, 1961. He coined the phrase, "That's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Just 4 months after being sworn in, Kennedy faced the Bay of Pigs invasion. The aim was to end the rule of Castro. The CIA was sent in, but the mission failed. Men were either killed or taken prisoner. The failed attempt to end communism further strained the relationship between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Thus, the Berlin Wall was built. In an attempt to find weaknesses in Kennedy, the Soviet Union began building missile bases in Cuba. This became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. A major goal of the Kennedy administration was the creation of the Peace Corps, a service organization that sends people to less fortunate areas. The Alliance for Progress was proposed to aid South American countries. It was a 10-year plan that allowed America to aid in South American economic development. On August 5, 1963, the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It forbid nuclear testing in the atmosphere. In 1962, James Meredith attempted to enroll at Ole Miss. This sparked massive protests and violence, and JFK sent in 23,000 federal troops to restore order. A similar situation occurred at the University of Alabama in 1963. The Birmingham campaign brought civil rights to the attention of JFK when protesters were attacked with hoses, prods, and dogs. JFK addressed the nation with a speech stating a moral crisis. Under JFK, the number of soldiers in Vietnam expanded from 700 to 15,000. The U.S., hoping to stabilize South Vietnam, led a coup. The coup ended the rule of Diem but failed to stabilize the country. On November 22, 1963, JFK was assassinated. With the assassination of JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in and began his Great Society campaign with the War on Poverty. In launching his War on Poverty, Johnson promoted economic growth with the Economic Opportunity Act. It aided in the areas of health, education, and general welfare of the impoverished. Johnson was adamant about civil rights, and in 1964 passed the Civil Rights Act. It railed against racial and sexual discrimination. In 1964, the Republicans nominated Goldwater as their presidential nominee, putting much pressure on Johnson. He ran a quiet campaign but beat Goldwater. Congress responded to his re-election by passing Medicare, which provided health services to the elderly. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution occurred after a North Vietnamese attack on 2 American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin and resulted in an increase in the military to 25,000. Johnson approved federal aid to schools and the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development to better poorer areas of cities. In continuing his fight for civil rights, Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices. The war in Vietnam took a turn around this time, and in 1965 the U.S. began to bomb North Vietnam. Troops increased to more than 180,000. Johnson had a strong faith in the U.S. military and a strong opinion of anti-communism. These beliefs led him to intervene militarily in the Dominican Republic in 1965, supposedly to stop a communist overtake. From 1965 to 1968, racial tensions heated up. The Watts riot was a 5-day-long riot that resulted in 34 deaths, and the Detroit riots resulted in over 7,000 arrests. The breaking down of civil rights in the Vietnam War brought an end to the Great Society. Vietnam caused sharp inflation. The Tet Offensive occurred in 1968 and was an attack of over 100 cities in South Vietnam. The My Lai massacre occurred as well and brought much opposition to the war. On March 31, 1968, Johnson announced that the bombing would stop in Vietnam and an end was near, but he chose not to run for re-election. To add to the chaos of the Johnson administration, on April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and civil rights activists were appalled. Johnson stopped all bombing of Vietnam on November 1st, but failed to truly make peace. Thus, the war continued. The announcement that Johnson would not seek re-election opened the door for the election of Nixon. He was inaugurated on January 20, 1969. Nixon improved relations with the Soviet Union as well as other communist countries with the use of détente. Détente was increased contact with other countries to reduce political tensions. In 1969, Chinese and Russian troops clashed along their common border, and Nixon set out to fix relations with China. Just a few months after his China visit, Nixon met with the USSR and agreed that a sale of surplus wheat would be sent to them. The Saltman Treaty was signed as well. Vietnamization was Nixon's plan for gradually handing power over to South Vietnam. The aim was to remove U.S. troops while increasing bombing of the North and money to the South. From 1969 to 1972, U.S. troops shrunk from 500,000 to 30,000, and peace talks were held in Paris. In 1969, the U.S. began bombing North Vietnamese supply routes in Cambodia. Then troops invaded the country in April of 1970. This led the process of Vietnamization. Widening the war to Cambodia, a neutral country, sparked demonstrations on college campuses. 4 students were killed by the Ohio National Guard at Kent State University on May 4, 1970. It appeared that an end to the war was near in 1972 at the Paris peace talks, but it was to no avail. In December 1972, bombing of the North was called for and became known as the Christmas bombing. It was opposed but led to the signing of the peace accords and an agreement over the War Powers Act. Under the accords, the last American troops left Vietnam in March, and North Vietnam released the final group of U.S. prisoners of war. Involvement in Vietnam cost the U.S. 58,000 lives. A few months after the ceasefire, fighting resumed between the North and the South, and an attack was launched in the spring of 1975 that led to the fall of Saigon in April.